Email signature management usually lands with IT. It starts small. A few templates, a few new employees, a few updates. But then the organization grows, meaning more employees, more devices, and more outbound emails. Exclaimer is centralized email signature management for IT. No scripts, automatic deployment, and easy integration with your existing email platforms. Visit exclaimer.com to learn more.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Memories of the past have a way of echoing and resonating in the historical present. And as I discussed with my special guest in this episode, this was quite true when the United States reached the centennial anniversary of the Civil War. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. My guest today, Tim Galsworthy, is a lecturer in history and military history at Lincoln Bishop College in the United Kingdom. Tim's research focuses on the interplay between memory, politics, and race in the modern United States. In particular, and as you will see in our discussion, he is interested in the relationships between the Republican Party and memories of the American Civil War. His first book, published last year, is The Republican House Divided: Civil War Memory, Civil Rights, and the Transformation of the GOP. Tim brings a wealth of information and a passion for history into his research on this pivotal period in American history. I cannot thank Tim enough for his time and the insight that he shared in this conversation, and I highly recommend checking out his book to learn more. I'll have a link on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com, so that you can get a copy of your very own. Without further ado, let's get to my conversation with Tim.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kann du Norsk?
If you used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world, with lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers. Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Spotify, spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Tim, thank you so much for joining us today. So glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me on, Jerry. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. And to get us started, you note in your work that, quote, historians have overlooked the prevalence of historical references in civil rights era republicanism. What got you interested in this topic? And knowing that it was a gap in historical research, how did you approach bringing together sources for your book?
Okay, that's a great question. It's the origin story of the book, as it were. Well, on the one hand, it kind of grows out from a kind of a broader growing interest in Civil War memory. So I did a Civil War class in my first year as an undergraduate. I did my undergraduate dissertation on Civil War memory because I discovered that's what interested me. And then I went off to do my master's. And while I was doing my master's, it was 2016, someone got elected on my birthday. And that all felt like a kind of coming together of kind of real world and academic world. And I also always found that there was kind of a lot of discussion about the Civil War centennial, but Republicans were conspicuously absent. And at the same time, there's a lot of conversation about the changes within the Republican Party in the 1960s, but Civil War memory was absent. So I thought, well, I'm seeing both of these in reading these two sets of books, and I feel like they need to come together. That's the kind of the simple story. Kind of long story is I was very fortunate in high school to spend 2 weeks on a school exchange in Massachusetts and kind of just fell in love with all things Americana. And that's where that started. In terms of sources, the Republican Party does not have one central archive. Some UK political parties, all their papers are in one place and you can just go and sit in that archive. Not so much. So it meant a lot of kind of jet setting around the US to specific, kind of particularly specific politicians or state parties like the Mississippi Republican Party, South Carolina Republican Party. But I actually did a lot of my research for the book, for my PhD, which then became the book, during COVID. So a lot of it was actually thanks to the brilliant hard work of archivists scanning and sending stuff. But it was very much a case of the spreadsheet I put together of archives and collections was so long, because lots of it was I just wanted 2 folders in one place, and it was just a lot of piecing together. But that was also great fun because you find stuff in these little one politician papers that you wouldn't necessarily get on big national level.
Absolutely. And like you, I'm always singing the praises of the archivists who are digitizing so many primary sources. It makes things so much easier. But there is also just that joy of going to an archive and, maybe one thing or a couple of things that you're
Yeah.
looking for, and there may be some hidden gems in there.
Yeah, and I was very lucky in that archivists. It wasn't so much it was digitized, but they were actually just scanning things for me because this was 2020, and lots of archives were they were open, but no one could go because of some states were in kind of limbo around their COVID laws. So they needed, they were happy to kind of have things to have something very focused to do. I made some great friends with archivists at Mississippi State, for instance, through this. But yeah, there's nothing like, I was fortunate enough just last year, for my next project, I was at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, which is fantastic. And we'll get on to Eisenhower in a bit. But the little celebratory archive dance that you get to do when you find the thing you were looking for, you found something you didn't know you were looking for until you found it.
I love it. I love it. It's been far too long since I've been to an archive, so you're getting me excited. Well, and as you said, Tim, the period that you cover begins with the 100-year anniversary of the Civil War. And as you illustrate, campaigns at the time drew on this anniversary in their campaign efforts. So how did the general public at the time approach the centennial of the war? And how was the invocation to Civil War memory in 1960 received by the voters?
So I think it's important to understand kind of Civil War memory in the Civil War centennial on two levels. So there's the kind of the official level. So in the late 1950s, kind of 1957 onwards, you get the Lincoln sesquicentennial. So that sort of kicks off the Civil War centennial early, kind of federal bodies connected to that. And then you get the Civil War Centennial Commission, the CWCC. That's the main kind of federal body. They're trying to organize on kind of a national level, big events. But then you also have state level that are sort of doing their own thing. And you get very different Civil War centennials. The New York Civil War centennial, for instance, driven by Nelson Rockefeller, Republican governor, has an input, but very driven by, you've got John Hope Franklin and Bruce Catton, kind of professional historians who actually drive it very much in a direction towards emancipation. That's what a lot of the New York state centennial's about. But then you get other ones, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, slightly different story, celebration of Confederate secession and very much tied to opposition to federal civil rights advances. It's harder to say kind of how individual kind of Joe and Josephine blogs in the public, Joe Public, are engaging with it. There's certainly an interest. So kind of there's statistics around visitorship at battlefield sites go up. Lots of books. So, Bruce Catton sells quite well. There's, in particular, the public seem interested in kind of some of the battle reenactments you get at First Manassas, and they do turn out some of the big events. But generally speaking, the kind of official centennial drops off in the second half. There's changes within the organization. It becomes much more scholarly. And also, kind of post-63, lots of the Southern associations don't really want to remember. Once you get past Gettysburg, it's a lot of losses. So they don't really get the buy-in that you had early on. In terms of 1960, Republicans really dwell on kind of the centennial of Lincoln's victory. So the Republican National Convention is in Chicago. They have a replica of the Wigwam building. The gavel that's used is supposedly the one that was used for Lincoln. There's there's pictures of Lincoln everywhere. There's this very deliberate association. What it speaks to, I think, is something that we'll talk through throughout the conversation, that I talk throughout the book, is that Lincoln is everywhere and nowhere. So to some Republicans, as to some Americans more generally, it's a very deep, visceral of, he's the emblem of everything we want to be. And whether that's kind of an emancipationist Lincoln or a frontier Lincoln or whatever it is, there's this very real Lincoln. For others, it's very platitudinal. In the same way that people will say, well, Martin Luther King had a dream, and that's their kind of only engagement with Martin Luther King's memory. You get very similar kind of platitudinal, what I'd call plastic memory of Lincoln, just kind of odd quotes. But also, I'd say as well, it's very broad in the sense that I think there's a quote, a line I have in the book, that he's claimed by everyone from socialists to segregationists, because Lincoln said something about pretty much everything, from kind of the value of labor over capital to some of his comments during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, you can effectively claim him anywhere on the political spectrum. So that's, wherever you are on the Republican spectrum, there's a Lincoln you can use in 1960 and onwards.
And it's interesting when we get to figures like that, and I imagine it, of course, I'm more familiar with American history, but it's probably in other national histories as well. But in the American context, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, there's so many different ways to approach them. And then folks can kind of cherry pick what they want from that to use for whatever purposes. And so it's interesting, having Lincoln as one of these figures, and in particular, having it be something that was a factor in an election 100 years after he became president.
Yeah, and I think I would argue, I'm a kind of interested in civil war memory, so I probably would say this. I think by the time you get to 1960, Lincoln is the big president. It's Lincoln and Washington and maybe Jefferson, but I would argue less for when he's president, more for kind of founding father Jefferson. But Lincoln is probably top dog, really, by this point, and he's so malleable. That's the phrase I use all the time. And I think that within a British context, Churchill is probably the closest thing. Very much claimed across the board, from those who, want a United States of Europe, because that's what Churchill wanted, to those who kind of use him for more kind of racial populist reasons. He's claimable in those terms. And I think it's important to say, and it's a case I make in the book, I don't think anyone voted Republican or swayed votes because of uses of Civil War memory. I don't think it changed people's minds. I think it solidifies opinions. And I think it helps politicians and ordinary people and journalists and everyone in between kind of articulate their view. People, it's, the idea of a usable past. And that's where Lincoln fits in. Because whether you know the ins and outs of everything Lincoln did, or he was the great guy that won the Civil War, in 1960, Lincoln is. So it's a useful reference point, right?
Absolutely. Well, and as you described, this was a time of flux for the Republican Party. You got these different factions, and so they've already got their arguments together, but being able to draw on that prestige of, we're connecting this to Lincoln, it helps with that factional infighting. But, it was interesting because, 1960, we have, and you mentioned him earlier, Dwight Eisenhower is leaving office. And you reference him at certain points in your book and his reluctance to interfere in the political internal struggles of the party in the 1960s, because, even after he left office, of course, he's still Eisenhower. And so, Tim, would you mind sharing more with us about Eisenhower's approach to the party factions? And based on your research, do you think he could have done anything to ease the tensions and influence the direction of the party in his post-presidency?
So we're actually getting into my current next project. So my actual current project is about Eisenhower's post-presidency. I'm researching his post-presidency, in particular in relation to Southern Republicanism. So I don't want to say too much because it's still relevant.
Little teaser.
Yeah, as the most nerdy tease ever. But yes, so what I could say is, certainly from the book, is I think he's reluctant is the right word. So there's the sense that in 1960, I think Eisenhower always regrets he didn't campaign more for Nixon. Now he would turn around and say, well, Nixon didn't ask me to, but the quip, he makes a quib to a journalist. Journalist asks him what's Nixon's achievements. He said, well, give me a week and I'll get back to you. What he means to say is, I'll let me prepare a detailed list. But it sounds like he has to think, which is not great when you're a vice president basically clinging to Eisenhower's coattails. Now, kind of combining the book and combining my my current project, I think on the one hand, I kind of agree with the Eisenhower revisionists and post-revisionists. He's much more politically engaged than people give him credit for, or early gave him credit for. I think he's deeply invested in the Republican Party in the 50s and in the 60s. I'm making the case in my current research that actually he's not even averse to kind of the conservative direction. I think he thinks Goldwaterism's too far. But I make the case in the book, and this is the thing I'm focusing on, he appears on stage in South Carolina with two segregationist Republicans. He legitimizes them, okay? And I think Eisenhower's relationship with kind of Southern Republicanism is more complicated than people accept. He's willing to play on the lost cause throughout his presidency to win Southern support. Now, I think from looking at the archives, he's clearly awkward about Goldwater, but he doesn't feel he can rock the boat. He doesn't feel it's his place to dictate. Now, I'm not sure, actually, if he'd come in and said, you all need to back. He doesn't like Rockefeller either. So he has that problem. If he's in the middle of the two and he doesn't really want to back Rockefeller, he doesn't have that moderate candidate that I think he could have thrown his weight behind. Maybe Scranton, maybe some of the others. But I'm not convinced it would have made a massive difference, because the kind of the Goldwater takeover, the Phyllis Schlafly, the kind of the grassroots movement that entered the Republican Party from 1961 onwards, take the party over from the bottom up. They're reacting against Eisenhower's style of politics, but also the conception they have of the Eastern Seaboard kingmakers. The idea that you've had Dewey and you've had Wilkie and you've had Eisenhower, and that's all been decided by, in their eyes, the kind of Phyllis Schlafly argument eyes, by Eastern Seaboard kingmakers. So if Eisenhower had got more involved, I actually think it might have backfired. I think it might have tipped even more people over to Goldwater. But it's hard to say. It's hard to, it's a counterfactual. I think if there'd been a more viable, moderate candidate, might have been the different story, because effectively your two viable candidates were Goldwater very much on the left, very much on the right, of the GOP, and Rockefeller very much on the left. And the Eisenhower kind of moderate internationalist faction, I'm not sure it's ever triumphant. Eisenhower's triumphant. Whether Eisenhower's style of republicanism is ever triumphant is more up for question, I would say.
Well, and we look forward to more insights from your next book. And please feel free to reach out. Would love to have you on again to talk about that. But
yeah, I'm still working on the articles. I'm still making my notes. But I think there's something to say, because I think I'm kind of trying to intervene in the kind of discussion around Eisenhower and the kind of revisionist, post-revisionists. But I think those kind of debates have not really been applied to his post-presidency. And I also, essentially what I'm doing is comparing a few speeches he did. And I think you can hopefully draw some conclusions about how he's approaching Southern republicanism. So I guess watch this space, folks, if that sounds like something that interests you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Looking forward to it. And then, in the meantime,
yes,
because you mentioned him, when you're talking about the Republican Party during this time, of course, one of the key figures to address is Barry Goldwater. Like him or fear him, whatever, he's in the room. You've got to talk about him. And so you illustrate in your work how Goldwater used Civil War memory, particularly in his 1964 campaign, in outreach efforts to Southern segregationists, as well as folks in the North who were wary of racial integration. So, Tim, could you share with us how Goldwater used references to Abraham Lincoln in the early days of the Republican Party to justify his anti-civil rights positions?
Yeah, so Goldwater and Civil War memory, I think, is really, really interesting. Again, deeply underappreciated, which is why I wanted to talk about it in the book. On the one hand, he and his supporters are at pains to claim Lincoln. So, he kind of presents himself in the same vein as, he has this phrase he writes in Human Events, conservative newspaper, conservative magazine, and he often uses in speeches, Lincoln was a conservative and I'm a conservative. So he presents kind of Lincoln as an anti-federal government, do it on your own, self-sufficiency kind of guy. And that's very much kind of Goldwater's philosophy. And what you get as well, he presents the most notable speech really is after he's won the nomination. He appears in Springfield. He goes and visits Lincoln's tomb and kind of rubs the bust and all that kind of stuff. And he says, him and his running mate are kind of, he says, we're joining hands. That's the phrase he uses. This idea that Goldwater and his stance for law and order and against kind of overreach and excess by the civil rights movement is the same as fighting for freedom. It's fighting for freedom like Lincoln fought for freedom. But I think actually the relationship between Goldwater and Lincoln memory is even more interesting when you get to his supporters. So a lot throughout 1964, Goldwater's detractors, Scranton, Rockefeller, and others are constantly saying he's out of step with Lincoln. He's out of step with Lincoln. He's betraying our Lincolnian heritage. And what you get from Goldwater's supporters is they turn around and say, well, no, he's not. Goldwater, they say Lincoln was a conservative and so is Goldwater. Some of them even say, particularly Southern supporters, Lincoln was a segregationist and so's Goldwater, even though Goldwater would deny he was a segregationist. And they make that point. And again, that speaks to that malleable Lincoln. But as well, what you see is Goldwater, not that I've found, other than he refers to Arizona as kind of Confederate territory during the Civil War, I've never found a kind of overt embrace of the lost cause. He refers to the Civil War as the war between the states. What you see is these kind of winks and nods. He addresses white Southerners and talks about their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers and what they fought for in the Democratic Party. Now, they're winks and nods to Reconstruction and redemption. They're just quite subtle and kind of playing on the idea of, well, the Democratic Party's not deserted you. You've not deserted the Democratic Party, it's deserted you. But again, as well, what you get from some of his supporters, particularly Southern supporters, is they do use the lost cause. They do tie him to the Confederacy or to Redeemers. You know, there's a great quote from Florence Sellers Ogden, a conservative activist and newspaper columnist in Mississippi, who says, you know, effectively, my Confederate grandfathers would vote for Goldwater. And that's the language you see in a lot of kind of private communication as well, is this idea, well, he fulfills what we want. So Goldwater's Civil War memory is really, really complicated. He's much more comfortable talking about Lincoln, but they are a bit stretched. And I think, again, more than anything, it speaks to that incredible malleability of Civil War memory generally and Lincoln's memory in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's so interesting. And this is one of the things that you address at certain points in your book. You know, this is a time that we're starting to get to the end of this era where you could say something in one region of the country and then say something else in another region of the country and not have them learn. Maybe it's not all aligning depending on where you are and, you know, how you're trying to address folks. But you know, there's still time. There's still a little bit of that. You know, you can do a unique appeal in the South versus the North. And it was just fascinating, you know, this wink and a nod visually of, you know, having the Confederate flag at campaign events and having Dixie played. It's a fascinating period to study, and just how, you know, even if like Goldwater didn't directly appeal to it, there were enough visual and cues for folks to pick up and, oh yeah, he's with us.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say, like, often that isn't being done by Goldwater, or I'm not even sure it's done by Goldwater's team. Often the Dixie is just, if he's on the stump in the South, you know, you play Dixie. That's kind of just the norm for kind of Southern campaigning. And you have attendees bringing Confederate battle flags. I have a great example in the book of where he's greeted at an airport in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and they're dressed up in Confederate replica uniforms and with a Confederate flag. And it's just when I first read that in a newspaper, I was like, oh my goodness, like this is what I'm driving at. But I think it actually that in 64 speaks to stuff that's been going on in the early 60s, where you've had Southern Republicans running, particularly at kind of state level, and running for the Senate, running for governorship, and not necessarily winning, but coming very, very close. And when they're coming from essentially zero for 100 years, or, you know, 80, 85 years to 40, 43, 46, 49% of the vote, using Civil War memory, embracing the kind of classic lost cause, tragic era trappings of Confederate flags and Dixie and attacking Reconstruction. It's a key thing that Southern Republicans had to do to overcome the legacy of Reconstruction, to overcome the negative association between the GOP and Reconstruction. So in many ways, in my argument, Goldwater's not initiated this. He's building off what Southern Republicans have said before. But I think it's important to say, I've not found him openly, directly embracing pro-Confederate lost cause memory really anywhere. It's very much transplanted onto him by his supporters.
Absolutely. And it's just that campaign energy. It's just, there's so much that a campaign can plan for, and there's so much that just happens on the ground that, you know, it can have an effect. And in this case, you know, it did. Well, and it's interesting because, you know, one of the things I love about your work is that you follow this important thread through the book about how Black Republicans were navigating the shifting politics of the larger party. And you wrote at one point that, quote, Black Republicans were not homogenous in their relationships with Civil War memory. So would you mind talking about the role Civil War memory played in the realignment of Black Republicans during the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, and I should say on Black Republicans, which I think are a fascinating and topic of growing interest, I'm building on brilliant research of scholars like Lee Wright Rigueur and Joshua Farrington and Timothy Turber that have gone before me, who've really mapped out the kind of complex role of Black Republicans. What I've tried to add to the mix is, well, Civil War memory is more important in that story than you're telling. So on the one hand, particularly in kind of the early 60s up to 64, there's a relative uniformity, not complete, because you have conservative Black Republicans like Clyde Clybourne, but there's a general uniformity of they're associated with the Rockefeller wing of the GOP, the more kind of left of the right, as it were, of the GOP. And they embrace what I term in the book Republican emancipationist memory. So this idea that, building on David Blight's coinage, emancipationist Civil War memory, this idea that emancipation, ending slavery, that was what the GOP was about. That's what it was founded for, and that's what we should live up to. They really play on this idea. What happens is 64 is a real rupture in that, 6% of African Americans who can vote for Goldwater. Like it's a complete drop off. And the GOP has never really recovered, frankly, in its relationship with Black voters. And what you get is some Black Republicans who stick true to that kind of emancipationist rhetoric and say, we're the party of Lincoln, we're the party of emancipation, we've got to get back to that. But tied with that is you get other Black Republicans who are more cynical now and say, well, shouting Lincoln doesn't mean anything. What's the point of us shouting Lincoln if we can't show African Americans in action that we're going to do something? So that, that's another way in which this 64 election and Goldwater is this massive rupture for Black Republicanism. So you get that. They still see the GOP as the party of Lincoln and emancipation. They just don't think saying that is enough in isolation. And I kind of finish in the last chapter. You get this really interesting moment in the Nixon years. You still have kind of progressive Black Republicans who are lobbying for a pro-civil rights GOP, but you also get this not insignificant block of more conservative pro-Nixon Black Republicans, people like Arthur Fletcher or Stanley Scott, who are working within the administration, and they see they very much align with the Nixon civil rights strategy, which is to move away from kind of a social focus to an economic focus and to kind of Black capitalism and Black entrepreneurship and Black self-help, the office of minority business enterprise, that kind of philosophy. And they use civil memory, but they use it slightly differently. They talk about kind of emancipating African Americans from the one-party system of loyalty to Democrats. They talk about emancipation from welfare. And they very much tie the language of emancipation and anti-slavery to economics and and entrepreneurship and self-help. So that's what I mean about, it's important that, African Americans as a voter bloc, let alone Black Republicans, are not treated as a monolith, as I think they very flippantly sometimes are. And to get at that Black Republicans have a complex, nuanced relationship with the GOP, and that as a result, there are different Black Republicans and different Black Republican groups using the Civil War using Civil War memory in different ways to get their points across throughout the 60s and 70s, which I'm looking at. And obviously, it's the case beyond that as well.
Absolutely. Well, and that's one thing I love about history and helping folks understand that, with any group, there's not just, one overarching opinion or one overarching response. There are typically, it's more nuanced, and it's when you get to the nuances, when you start to understand that you develop a deeper and richer history, and you really get to understand what's going on, and that these are people, not, like you said, monolithic groups.
And I think that rings really true as well for white Southerners and white Southern Republicans. So I know it's something you wanted to talk about later, but I can jump in here because I think it fits well.
Go right ahead.
Particularly after 1965, when you get the Voting Rights Act, when you get mass enfranchisement of African Americans in the South, then Southern politicians generally, Southern Republicans in particular, have to adapt to that. What are they going to do? And what you see in both parties is you get one reaction is, no, we're going to double down. We're going to be racially conservative still, and we're going to appeal to kind of the still unreconstructed white Southerners. You see that in both parties. There are still, racially conservative Democrats into the 80s, into the 90s, and there are racially conservative Republicans who are very much, they can't say segregation, so they're going to talk about busing, and they're going to talk about other issues. But there are also Southern Democrats and in my study, Southern Republicans who realize, well, We can't just write off. If you're in a state like Mississippi and you've got massive increase in voter registration from less than 10% to well over, nearly over 60%, you can't write off that block. You cannot just say, well, they're all going to vote Democrat, because in that case, Republicans are never going to break open the South into two-party politics. So you start to see some Southern Republicans increase their outreach to black voters. And when you see it, the 67 gubernatorial election, Rubel Phillips, he'd run in 63 as an ardent segregationist. 67, he's still racially conservative, but he talks openly. He says, well, segregation's dead. Like, we've got, it might be what I want, but it's dead. So we need to move on. We need to embrace economic interdependence. He loses worse in 67 than 63. So maybe that's a lesson. But you really see, to focus on Mississippi in particular, you really see the racial moderation that's pioneered by Rubel Phillips persist. And it's particularly in a guy called Gil Carmichael. He runs for the U.S. Senate in 1972. He runs for governor of Mississippi in 75. He loses both, but very narrowly. And he really goes for kind of black outreach. He appears, I can't remember if it's 72, I think it's 75. He campaigns in Mound Bayou, famous all African-American town in Mississippi. Come back to the fore of people's minds because it's mentioned in Sinners recently. But he goes and campaigns there. He has photographs of himself with black children. He plays up the fact that he'd been advising the Nixon administration on school desegregation. So there are, in this moment, Southern Republicans who, yes, they talk conservatively about busing, and maybe they'll talk about federal welfare and all that sort of stuff, which we know is coded language. But at the same time, they're embracing or wanting to embrace black voters. So I think it's important to understand throughout my whole book, I don't like counterfactual history, but there are always paths that could have been taken differently for the GOP, for voters, for America more generally, about there were political alternatives for the way the politics goes. I think that's never more true than when it comes to Republican outreach to African Americans in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act.
Absolutely. And reading some of that, and in particular with Mississippi, but you also bring up cases in other states. But Mississippi, since I do have ties to there, my alma mater is in Jackson.
Yeah.
It sent me on a rabbit hole of trying to learn more and doing some additional research. So kudos to that. It's always good when you can inspire more research with your work. But
I chose, I couldn't write about everything. And I chose, when I'm talking about Southern Republicanism, I focus in the book on Mississippi, South Carolina, and Alabama. My justification for that is those are three states that at the start of my book, which starts in 1960, didn't have a single Republican in Congress, didn't have a single Republican representative. By the end of the book, they all have at least one. And, South Carolina, you end up with a Republican senator in Strom Thurmond. Mississippi, South Carolina again, by the mid-70s, you end up with a Republican governor. And also, those are the three states that voted most solidly for Goldwater. So you've gone from these solidly Democratic states to, Mississippi gives Goldwater 87% of the vote in 64. So I think those three states in particular are really useful for tracking changes. And also, they're states that are just so steeped in the lost cause and kind of Confederate memory and hatred of the Republican Party after Reconstruction. So trying to put the puzzle together. And I'd often do this when I'm talking to public audiences. I have to explain kind of the big switch because it kind of blows people's minds about kind of Republicans in the Civil War versus Republicans in the 1960s versus Republicans today. And I think using Civil War memory and using the Civil War and that long history of Reconstruction, that actually helps it make more sense, in my opinion.
Absolutely, it does. And it's interesting, and that's one thing I think you do very well in your book. You illustrate how this all works together, and the picture becomes clear as to why this happened and why it happened when it did. And you see, and as we move along, you see this continuing, trying to actively garner this support in the South by Republicans. And one that I just had to ask you about because he's a fascinating figure in history and somebody I'm eventually going to cover on my vice presidency special series. But you refer to Vice President Spiro Agnew at one point as President Nixon's, quote, ambassador to the South. Can you tell us more about how Agnew worked to garner support for the Republican Party and the Nixon administration from white Southerners?
Yeah, so I think that's a quote from a journalist. I can't take credit from Ambassador to the South. I also call him Nixon's Southern attack dog. I think that's my college. So I think it's important to kind of get Agnew to get to the end, to get to the answer to your question. So obviously he's governor of Maryland, border state, has its own complexities of civil rights, but Agnew is very much seen as a moderate in the mid to late 60s. He initially backs Nelson Rockefeller in 1968. But a key moment is you get the quote unquote riots, rebellions, uprisings after Martin Luther King's assassination in April 1968. And in that moment, Agnew chooses to kind of publicly lambast civil rights leaders for not condemning the disorder, not condemning Black Power. And in that, he becomes very quickly a kind of a poster boy for law and order politics. In 1968, when Nixon is trying to shore up his ticket, obviously the Republican platform, the Republican appeal in 68 is very much tied to law and order. Agnew is a perfect running mate because he's popular in the South because of his comments, and also he compliments Nixon well. So in 68, he is very much dispatched to the South. It's up to him and Thurmond, basically, up to him and South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, who'd also backed Nixon, key in getting Nixon the nomination in 68. John Tower, another Southern Republican, refers to the Southern delegates at the RNC as the thin gray line that never broke for Nixon. So just throw that in there, another Confederate reference. And because in 68, George Wallace is running, okay, so they know they're probably not going to win in the Deep South, but they can win that they can win in the border South. They can win maybe in your Virginias and your North Carolinas, because that language of law and order is not openly segregationist. It's not as out there as Wallace. So Agnew is able to pick up the support of white Southerners, particularly in suburbs that they reject out and out segregation, they reject out and out racism, but they're still uncomfortable with elements of the civil rights revolution and the kind of changes in the US more generally in the 1960s. And they end up winning border South states, and Thurmond helps Nixon hold South Carolina as well. And then you get into the Nixon presidency, and I see Agnew's role as very similar. He is the one to go out and support the Southern strategy by being much more overtly courting white Southerners. Nixon does it as well, but Agnew's even more out there. And he does give campaign speeches, particularly in Alabama and Mississippi, where he's celebrating elements of the Confederate, and South Carolina as well, of the Confederacy and Jefferson Davis and things like that. And this really reaches its zenith in 1970, when he speaks at the dedication of Stone Mountain. So the massive stone reliefs of Davis, Lee, and Stonewall Jackson in Georgia. It was meant to be Nixon. He stays in DC dealing with Cambodia protests, and also, I think, as far away from it as possible. And Agnew, it's not the most exciting speech, but he describes kind of Lee, Jackson, and Davis as model Americans, and denies that Lee believed in slavery and secession and all the kind of lost cause tropes. And I think for me, it's a real emblematic of the fact that in 1960, you had the Lincoln Convention, to 1970, you've got a Republican vice president speaking at the biggest Confederate monument in the world, and defending Confederates. And on the same day, Nixon goes to the Lincoln Memorial to talk to anti-war activists that have gathered in DC. So literally, as I put in the book, it's very poetic. You literally have the president and vice president, Republican president and vice president, standing in the shadows of Lincoln and Lee on the same day. And if that doesn't tell you how far things have changed. But obviously, Agnew is just very good at speaking the coded language, the language of what we might call the dog whistle, that he's not being openly, explicitly talking about race, but he is kind of cultivating those who are not happy or dissatisfied with the changes that are going on in the United States, whether that's to do with race or generational changes around schools and universities or the anti-war movement. He captures anger. He's so good at kind of tapping kind of populist anger and turning it on the media and all that thing. So there's a lot to it. I think Agnew is absolutely fascinating. I would very much like to listen to the podcast episode on Agnew in your Vice President series. But I think it's underappreciated how he, as part of Nixon's Southern strategy, leans in to the lost cause. And him and Nixon, I argue, help normalize and nationalize the lost cause away from being used by Southern Republicans or in the South to being this thing that could be used by national Republican leaders on a national level.
Well, and speaking of something that is kind of lesser known or lesser understood, I can't resist because I see the poster in your background. For our listeners, Tim has a poster of this figure that I'm going to ask about, Nelson Rockefeller, because I think that most folks thinking of the modern GOP don't necessarily realize how there was this liberal faction that was at one point fairly strong, and Rockefeller was a part of that. Would you mind sharing a little about Rockefeller and kind of the impact that he had at the time and, what legacy he left?
I will also, as disclaimer, I have Goldwater memorabilia and Eisenhower memorabilia, so there is no factional faction that dominates in our household, and it is all memorabilia. It's very much not a signal of alignment with any faction or any party, for that matter. I'll just do the very British disclaimer.
I can say the same thing. I've got books on all of the presidents around me, so.
There is more Rockefeller than anything else, so I don't know what that means. So Nelson Rockefeller, obviously, probably, sorry, President Trump, probably the richest man to ever run for president. That's probably, and he runs 3 times. Becomes governor of New York in the late 50s. And one of the, he's running against a very, very rich Democrat, Averell Harriman. And he very much represents, it's called Rockefeller republicanism by some. And it's important to say there is still kind of a consensus, it's pro-capitalist. As a general rule, it still doesn't necessarily like the federal government, but Rockefeller and Rockefeller Republicans are much more willing to have kind of an activist state, certainly at state level, a very, very kind of pro-civil rights. Rockefeller and his allies very much want to ally themselves with Martin Luther King and the kind of mainstream and Black freedom struggle. In 1960, kind of Rockefeller doesn't really run, but he kind of runs, and it forces Nixon to have these. They agree a program. He flies to New York and meets Rockefeller. Nixon does, and they agree this platform, which really angers. Agree these kind of 10 points, and it really angers Goldwater and conservatives. 64, after Nixon loses, Goldwater, I think, thinks he's got the nomination in the bag. Rockefeller thinks he's got the nomination in the bag. He wins re-election in 62 quite comfortably. It seems to be that his kind of vision is ascendant. He makes the mistake, though, of he's appealing to the nation at large. Goldwater and his supporters Goldwater's supporters are just quietly filling the GOP with Goldwaterites so that they can win it without really needing to go to the country. He also makes the mistake of he divorces and then marries his lover, who also had divorced and given up custody of her children, which is probably not a play that's going to adhere you to many in a kind of very conservative, very religious party at the time. So he loses in 64. 68, it's a very last-ditch roll of the dice. He's won again in 66 as governor. He's very much allied himself again with the progressive factions within the GOP. It's a last throw of the dice in 68. It's never really meaningful. That's why I think actually he makes some of his most poignant speeches in 68, because I think he knows he's not going to win. He very much tries to fill the void in the race actually that's been lost by Robert Kennedy. He visits Watts, he visits black neighborhoods, he's doing some of the things that Robert Kennedy was doing before he was assassinated. He goes to Springfield, speaks at Lincoln's home, but he doesn't win. Nixon wins comfortably. And what you actually see, and I'm agreeing with a brilliant recent scholarship by Marcia Barrett on Nelson Rockefeller here. Great book. Rockefeller's Dilemma. I recommend it. It's got a great book cover because Lincoln's on it as well, which I could recommend. And I agree with her that Rockefeller becomes more conservative. He realizes that and I agree with her as well, that he was more conservative throughout the 60s, certainly as a governor, than people realize, particularly around laws on kind of drugs and policing, is that he sees the way the wind's blowing. In that if he wants to have any role in the GOP, he cannot be seen as the liberal Republican. So you get things like the Attica prison uprising in its response to that. You get mandatory drug laws and things like that. So much so that he stumps for Nixon quite actively in 1972, and so much so that he ends up as Gerald Ford's vice president. And by 1974, 1975, when he is rightly fearful that Ford's going to kick him off the ticket, he goes and, campaigns with George Wallace and shakes hands with the Southern Republicans he'd once so vehemently criticized in the early 1960s. He's a fascinating character. He's a contradictory character. He's an egotistical character. And his archive collection in Sleepy Hollow in Tarrytown in New York State is just a treasure trove for anyone wanting to understand the Republican Party in this period, for anyone wanting to understand, in particular, a kind of liberal, progressive republicanism, whatever you want to call it. And the great thing is, you go to the Rockefeller Archive Center, you can say you've been to the bathroom in John D. Rockefeller's bathroom, which is also a pretty cool thing to say. Because it's in a former Rockefeller kind of house property in the area, but he's a fascinating figure, and he's a real lightning rod. If you're a progressive Republican, he's the great flag bearer that's holding true to kind of the Theodore Roosevelt Lincoln tradition. If you're a conservative Republican, he's everything that's wrong with the GOP. He's a Democrat in all but name. He's rich and he's just buying his way through. So he's this real lightning rod, the kind of the great icon or the bête noire, dependent on kind of where you are in the GOP.
And again, somebody who's going to get his own vice presidency's episode down the road.
Listen to that one as well. His vice presidency is really interesting as well as a time period.
So, Tim, as we wrap up our conversation, I wanted to ask, based on your research, do you feel that the invocation of Civil War memory is as impactful in the modern day as it was in the Civil Rights era? Or has something shifted in the public consciousness of the Civil War since that time?
I think it's different. I think, obviously by the 1960s, it's out of lived memory, but it's not that far out. You would have parents, grandparents that had been alive in the Civil War era. It's different today, obviously. We're nearing, we've gone past the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, but anyone who has looked at any aspect of American and world history in the last decade can't pretend that Civil War memory isn't everywhere. From, the 2008 campaign and very deliberately cultivated similarities between Obama and Lincoln, from President Obama's team and from kind of supporters, through to Charleston Massacre in 2015 and debates around the Confederate flag, through to Charlottesville in 2017, the Unite the Right rally, the murder of Heather Heyer and the response that gets. Kind of Civil War memory, in particular, often gets very distilled into the issue of Confederate monuments and Confederate flags, but they in particular have become a real flashpoint on both sides. Either the sense of they don't represent a modern multiracial democracy, and they never did, versus, well, we need to defend them and defend history, and attacking them attacks American principles. How you can be American principles when they were a secessionist that were, tried to remove themselves from a nation is a separate issue, if you pardon the pun. But they've become, again, a lightning rod. They've become a lightning rod for broader social, cultural, political divisions in a polarized nation. I think we can safely say that. But I think as well within the Republican Party, I think they're a window into the GOP, actually. They're a window into the agent of the culture war, which effectively is what I think the Republican Party is when it comes to Civil War memory. Because on the one hand, you've got the kind of the band of never Trumpers. It's not insignificant that one of the most operational never Trump organizations call themselves the Lincoln Project, and kind of align themselves with kind of lots of Lincoln memory. Then you get kind of the Liz Cheney and others, Adam Kinzinger. They use the memory of Lincoln and that kind of the idea of the GOP and its origins to attack Trump and attack the kind of MAGA movement. You have the mainstream, I would say, kind of Republican, which is very kind of platitudinal. Well, Lincoln was a Republican, I'm a Republican, yay, kind of very simplistic terms, all the way through to kind of Trump and your Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world that use, defense of Confederate monuments as at the forefront of their political project to kind of defend its terms. And I think as well, the reason why, I was trying to finish the book and it was really hard because I kept having to rewrite the epilogue. When you had moments like Tim Scott launching his presidential campaign at Fort Sumter, not using the word slavery or Confederate. You had Nikki Haley, who had taken the Confederate flag, or been part of the taking the Confederate flag down in South Carolina in 2015, to her credit, denying that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. So I'm not going to sit here and say Civil War memory doesn't matter in modern American society politics when politicians and activists have decided that it does. And I think it does because fundamentally, if you want to understand division in the United States, if you want to understand regional division in the United States, if you want to understand partisan division, the Civil War and issues that the Civil War is about, race, states, federalism, the federal government, They're the issues that the Civil War was about. They're the issues that are at odds today. So it's no surprise that Civil War memory is everywhere. And I think it's incumbent upon us as historians to not just go, oh, well, why are all these people with Confederate flags? What I start the book, I should say, with January the 6th, 2021, the image of the person, the rioter, the insurrectionist, with a Confederate battle flag in the US Capitol. And this was this shocking moment for the US and for the world. But my attitude was that didn't come out of nowhere. That didn't emerge in a vacuum. I think that's the main message I would say of the book is, don't suddenly be shocked that Confederate flags are everywhere. Don't suddenly be shocked that a guy is waving a Confederate battle flag to support a Republican president. You should be shocked in historical terms, and here's why. So that's a long-winded way of saying Civil War memory is everywhere, Civil War memory matters, and historians need to take it seriously and not just leave it to be kind of glib observations in journalistic reporting on modern America.
And I think you help your readers to do that with this book, to really understand the importance of it. And so I cannot thank you enough for your work. I cannot thank you enough for your insights. The book is The Republican House Divided: Civil War Memory, Civil Rights, and the Transformation of the GOP. Tim, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me on, Jerry. I've really enjoyed the conversation. And I hope that listeners, whatever your political persuasion, can take something from the book. And you may have gathered what some of my political persuasion is from this conversation, but I am an objective scholar. I am a scholar rooted in history and evidence, as all the best history is. So I hope you take the time to read the book. I hope you take the time to judge it on its merits. And I hope to have future conversations about all things Civil War memory and Republican Party with you.
Absolutely. You have an open invitation, and especially when book number 2 comes.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you so much again to Tim Galsworthy for a great conversation about a landmark period of American history and the impact that presidential politics had on the course of events. Naturally, there was so much more in Tim's research that we didn't have a chance to get to in our discussion. So I highly recommend that you check out his book, The Republican House Divided: Civil War Memory, Civil Rights, and the Transformation of the GOP. I'll have a link so that you can get a copy of your very own on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to learn more about all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidency's podcast. I cannot thank our patrons enough for their financial support to ensure that I have the equipment and resources needed to continue this journey through presidential history. And I'd like to say a special thanks to our newest patron, Wesley. Thank you so much for your support. If you'd rather not make a monthly pledge, but still want to contribute to this work, there are other ways to do so. I have a research wish list available at tinyurl.com/presidenciespodcast with books identified that will help to prepare for upcoming episodes. You can also leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, or anywhere else with that capability. Word of mouth is still the most effective marketing out there, even in the 21st century. So please share information about the podcast on social media or with friends and loved ones who love history. I cannot thank all of you who have fulfilled book requests as well as shared with folks why they too should be listening to the Presidency's podcast. I'd also like to thank Alex for his audio editing work on this episode. He's been involved from the very beginning of this podcast. Indeed, he provided the initial inspiration to do this podcast, and since then, he has become a supporter behind the scenes. He has been an encourager. He has joined me on the Vice Presidency's episodes, and now he's finding a new way to contribute to this work, so I cannot thank him enough for all of that and much, much more. As always, please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you haven't already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.